body will go back to their own meeting and discuss that. But any kind of clarifying questions would be appropriate during the public hearing.
And
well, then let me try and get a better sense. You wish to get a sense of the council and PZC's view on this proposal, on the recommendations. What is the mechanism whereby you get that?
I think we're probably going to have to wait. Well, I'll let Tony answer. Go to see him.
I just having been on this, I think the best way to do it, Ron, for us is to ask the question in such a way that Ken and his group will have an idea of where our thinking is. We just can't say, I want you to do this. But you can say, how much support do you think there will be for X, Y, and Z? That sort of deal.
Well, let me just tell you what I would like to say, for example, is that as this is implemented, I have concerns that certain things be done in the implementation, which have been left not clear. So I wish to make those concerns known.
So put it in the question, when this is implemented, how will you accommodate such and such and such and such?
Oh, all right.
Please.
And I think right now we're looking at the plan, and we're looking at do we have the appropriate strategies within the plan that may give us give whoever is going to be implementing this plan broad enough latitude to do that. So we're really looking at this plan, we're looking at the plan, and if the goals and objectives are such that they will help us achieve our goal.
And obviously the public input.
Correct.
Al and Katie, are you guys related?
Yes, we are.
Are you in the same house?
Yes, we are.
Okay. My only concern really is if both machines are running, if we're going to get interference. So be alert to that, because sometimes when we have two machines running, at least in the same place, if somebody has a phone and a computer, we get really weird noises.
I understand.
Although it doesn't seem to be a problem right now. So
yeah, we've actually been in other joint meetings like this, and it has not been a problem because we're down the hall really from each other. We're not like in the same next office over, so to speak.
okay, we do not have
one short of a quorum.
we do not have a full council.
Oh no, I guess we have a quorum, and there are 5. Okay.
Me, Ron, Sam, Terry, and Al. Okay, we got it. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't see Terry, but yeah, you got 5. You can officially convene a meeting.
Good. All right, one more minute.
Hello, caller 3. Can you please identify yourself? Caller 3, are you Melissa?
Hello?
Yes, caller 3. You're caller 3. Can you identify yourself?
Hi, this is Melissa and
Okay.
Patrick.
All right, thank you.
All right, it's 7 o'clock, and this is a special meeting of the Mansfield Town Council and the Mansfield Planning and Zoning Commission to hold a public hearing
This conference
regarding.
will now be recorded.
Good evening. It's 7 o'clock. This is a special meeting of the Mansfield Town Council and the Mansfield Planning and Zoning Commission to hold a public hearing regarding an affordable housing plan. We've been working out the way to orchestrate our two boards simultaneously, and I will convene the board side, and Kenron will convene the planning and zoning side. We will do the formalities, first one and then the other, and then we will function as a an entire, a joint group. I will remind the members of the council that because this is a special meeting, nothing can be added to the agenda. And since the agenda has nothing on it besides the planning and zoning public hearing and an opportunity for the public to address the council, there is no opportunity for discussion. And if you have questions about the proposal in front of us, please use the opportunity while we have the staff and the presenters in front of us to ask you questions of them. For the public hearing, and I'm going to keep to our traditional 5-minute rules, where we will ask questions of the presenters only for clarification purposes. But the presentation by staff and invited guests, you're free to ask any question you want. So the first item on our agenda is a roll call. Ms. Chang, will you please call the roll of the council?
Yes. Osberger,
Here.
Berthelot,
Here.
Bruder,
Here.
Frattoni,
Here.
Freudman,
Mr. Freudman is still out sick.
Katchenberger,
Here.
Moran,
Here.
Shuren,
Here.
Shaken.
Here.
Thank you.
Mr. Ron, would you like to convene your Planning and Zoning Commission? You're
Muted.
muted.
I don't have a list. Jen, do you happen to have a list?
I do, yes.
Thank you.
So Accorsi,
Here.
Tandy,
Yeah.
Cooley,
Here.
here. Cooley,
Yes, I'm here.
great. Cotton,
Sorry.
Here.
Frattoni,
Here.
Plant,
Here.
Ron,
Here.
Ward.
Here.
I did not mention the absent members. Do I need to do that, Sarah Ann? Or will we just note that for the record?
Could you note now who's not here? Because I put that as, put those folks as excused.
Yeah. Aho. Sorry, I might have to look that up. Give me 1 minute. Who am I missing, Ken?
Paul Aho, I believe, is the only regular member. And then John
And then
DeVivo, who would be sitting if he were here.
Right, DeVivo.
Okay, so
Pardon me, but is Ward also an absent member?
No,
No,
Ward is
I'm
here.
Planning and
I'm here.
Ward's here.
okay, are we ready to proceed to the public hearing? Ms. Chang, will you please read the call to the public hearing?
Yes, the Mansfield Town Council will hold a joint public hearing with the Planning and Zoning Commission at 7 p.m. on June 23rd, 2021, virtually via GoToMeeting to solicit comments regarding the Affordable Housing Plan. Information regarding the Affordable Housing Plan is on file at the Town Clerk's Office for South Eagleville Road, Mansfield, and is posted on the town's website, mansfieldct.gov, dated at Mansfield, Connecticut, this 15th day of June, 2021.
All right, Mr. Aylesworth and Ms. Thompson, Ms. Kaufman, how do we proceed? Who is making a presentation?
Tonight we have Pat Gallagher from SLR, who has been our consultant and has been working with the ad hoc committee on affordable and workforce housing. And he has a presentation that was included in your packet, and we have given him, we've transferred the presentation capabilities over to him. So Pat, if you want to begin, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. For the record, my name is Pat Gallagher, a planner with SLR Consulting, formerly known as Mylona McBroom. Thanks for the opportunity to present to all of you tonight. And this has really been a collaborative process. Jennifer and Linda in the planning office have really shepherded this along the way, really spearheaded a lot of our community outreach, and of course working with the ad hoc committee as well. So I'll just go over the kind of why we're here today, give background on our planning process, and then present an overview of the draft plan to kind of set the stage for our public hearing tonight. So back in 2017, the Connecticut legislature passed a new statute requiring that municipalities create an affordable housing plan every 5 years. Similar to your plan of conservation and development, this is a living document that'll be updated on a regular basis. And the statute is fairly vague on what exactly they're looking for within this plan, other than that it should specify how Mansfield will increase the number of affordable housing units over that 5-year period, and then has some language regarding the process as well as the adoption and amendment process as well. Last year, the state issued a guidance document which provided some more information and context about what they're specifically looking for within affordable housing plans, and we've really followed that guidance to the T here for this draft plan. So the state statute really leaves things open-ended, and I think that has allowed us to really make this a community-driven process. This plan is not about the state's overarching goals or objectives. This is about what types of goals and strategies will work best for Mansfield, and we've really strove over the last 6 months to make this a true community-driven process. We established a project website back in the beginning of the project. I'll touch on that in a little more detail. We've had 2 surveys, the first of which had almost 900 respondents, and then the ad hoc committee wanting to get input on those strategies had a follow-up survey over the course of May and June with over almost 150 respondents. So again, a very community-driven process, a lot of input that we've garnered over the last 6 months. So we established a website using what we call a story map platform at the beginning of the project. And this was really to create a two-way flow of information. Affordable housing is a topic where, it tends to be, kind of an emotional topic. And so we wanted to take the opportunity to educate people on affordable housing, what we're trying to achieve with the affordable housing plan, as well as solicit input. So all of our survey links lived on this webpage so that we could educate folks before asking some pointed questions on their preferences and priorities. And this has gotten over 1,700 page views over the duration of the project, which has been great. So we know we've been reaching our audience. We launched our community survey in the spring, and thanks to Jennifer, Linda, and town staff for spearheading getting the word out. There was a mailer sent to every Mansfield household, and we ended up getting nearly 900 responses, which is a really great turnout. And this asked questions on community values, which is a component of the draft plan, as well as some questions on different housing needs within the community. And this really helped shape and direct some of the goals and the strategies that are included in the draft plan. We presented some initial strategies to the ad hoc committee, I believe back in May, and the ad hoc committee really wanted to get further input from the community on those strategies and really make sure that the direction that they were headed was supported by the community. And so we ended up having a follow-up survey with nearly 150 respondents, asking them very specific questions about the strategies that are included in the draft plan, including how to raise money to support affordable housing programs through a proposed housing trust fund, as well as, if it were up to them, how would they prioritize expenditures from that fund. And so this was able to give us some really good feedback. I think one of the things that stuck out to me was there was openness to raising money through a range of mechanisms, whether that be grants, fees in lieu, or inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning fees, a little less support for funding through the town budget, which would have a more direct impact on taxpayers. I guess not surprising on that front. And then we asked them how they would prioritize expenditures, and repair and rehabilitation projects were their top priority amongst the 149 respondents, followed by creating more units for families with children, as well as for seniors. And then we know from our data analysis, those are two populations that have some unique housing challenges, given your position as a university town. So that then led into our draft plan, and the state guidance was really reinforced that community-driven process, and that means starting off with the community values statement. And this is slightly modified from the value statement in your Plan of Conservation and Development that was adopted back in 2015. So really highlighting some of the real assets and services your community has to offer, having that positive relationship with the University of Connecticut, steering development towards specific nodes of development while keeping that rural setting throughout most of the remainder of town, and then supporting a diverse and equitable housing stock that supports the need for all of your residents. The draft plan then gets into some background information on what is affordable housing, and this is a lot of the same information that we had on our website over the course of the project. And per statute, affordable housing is defined as protected affordable units that cost less than 30% of a household's income for households that make less than 80% of area median income. And in Mansfield, if you're a family of four and make less than $78,500 per year, you may qualify for a protected affordable unit. And so I think that was a part of our conversation with the community, was to educate, who are we talking about when we're talking about providing affordable housing? And many members of your community, including many of the folks that took the survey, could qualify for programs and maybe weren't aware of that before this process started. So getting into some of the reasons why affordable housing is important. It allows people to live where they work. UConn is a major employer in town, and very few Mansfield workers actually live in Mansfield. A vast majority live elsewhere, and part of that may be due to the lack of housing options. And so broadening that housing diversity may give them an opportunity to live closer to where they work. It gives low-income households access to quality services and schools that they may not get in another community that has a larger affordable housing stock. And then there's significant research that has shown that low-income households that have access to these high-opportunity services have better health, social, emotional, and educational outcomes. The discussion around housing has been really addressing some of the long-standing results of our housing policy, both at the state and local level. And so these affordable housing plans can help address some of those historical shortcomings that have led to racial and socioeconomic segregation within our state over the last 50 years. It allows seniors to age in place, especially as they move to smaller housing units or perhaps move from a homeowner unit to a renter unit. And finally, it allows young adults to live in the communities that they grew up in. And again, it's about providing that broad spectrum of housing that supports that diverse population. Another important component of our process was to educate the community on what affordable housing looks like. And I think a common misconception is that affordable housing is only your high-density apartments. And we really made a tremendous effort to educate folks on affordable housing can really fit into any context. It looks just like any other regular housing and can range from single-family homes to the more traditional apartments to townhomes or accessory dwelling units, and then providing some case studies of what affordable housing looks like in different communities throughout Connecticut. The plan includes a summary of our data-driven needs assessment, and that looks at overall housing demographic trends, as well as infrastructure capacity, both water and sewer service, as well as transit, as well as a review of your existing zoning regulations. And that's been something you've been very proactive on, at kind of being at the forefront of inclusionary zoning and housing policy. And so we really had a good jumping off point when we did that review here. Looking at how much affordable housing Mansfield has now, as of 2020, you have just under 400 units that meet the statutory definition of affordable housing. And that is about 6.6% of your housing units. And the state has a goal for each municipality to hit 10% affordable units, and municipalities that don't are subject to the Affordable Housing Appeals Procedure, more commonly known as 8-30G. Another thing to note is that the percent affordable housing is calculated based off of your housing counts from the latest decennial census. And so today, your percentage is calculated based on the year 2010 housing unit count. That's going to be updated once the 2020 data is released and reflect the several hundred units that have been built since 2010. And so we anticipate that that percentage will go down once that data is released. And so that 10% will be a goal to continue to work towards over the next 5 years, the duration of this plan. So getting into our draft plan recommendations, the first goal is to strengthen the town's capacity to further affordable housing. We have some ambitious goals and objectives within this plan, and that's going to require an additional level of oversight, both from a governmental and elected official oversight, as well as from a staff oversight. And so one of the recommendations is to establish a permanent housing committee that can oversee the implementation of this plan and provide guidance to other boards and commissions. Many of these recommendations may require additional staff resources, and so providing adequate staffing and skill sets to administer these affordable housing programs is important. Providing regular training to staff and members of land use boards. I believe actually this is a new state requirement based on the last legislative session, so this will help you be in compliance with that new requirement. And then also amend this plan to the Plan of Conservation and Development so that as the Planning and Zoning Commission is reviewing future applications, this affordable housing plan is held to the same standard as the rest of your Plan of Conservation and Development and can really aid in that land use decision process. The second recommendation is to establish a housing trust fund. So today, Mansfield has a mechanism allowing developers who don't meet your inclusionary zoning requirements to pay a fee in lieu of providing those affordable units. Today, that money gets donated to a not-for-profit housing developer, which I believe the only one in Mansfield is your housing authority. Establishing a housing trust fund would allow the town to then collect those fees in lieu and then use that to further its affordable housing priorities. And so the first step of that would be to actually establish that housing trust fund by modifying your town ordinances. We provided a model ordinance as an appendix to the plan. And then the other two strategies under this goal is to focus on creating deed restricted units. Those will count towards that 10% affordable housing goal. And many deed restricted units also have requirements that would protect them for families, senior households, and they're less likely to be occupied by students because they have more stringent household and income requirements. And then finally, a follow-up is going to be to prioritize how that money is spent. And our strategy survey can help provide some of that initial guidance on where the community sees the priorities. And the way that statutes are written, you really have a range of options on how you spend this money, whether it's purchasing land to support a project, providing financing to a developer, making infrastructure improvements, even purchasing deed restrictions from an existing development. So there's a lot of potential options on the table that'll need to be kind of specified. So the third goal is really how do we raise money for this housing trust fund? And today, again, you have that fee in lieu of option, and developers are required to build 10% affordable housing, and they also have workforce housing requirements. So the strategy 3.1 is to increase that inclusionary zoning requirement from 10% today to 12%. And that's largely because if you keep requiring 10% and developers keep building 10%, you're never going to quite reach that 10% goal. And so by making that threshold a little bit higher than 10%, you're going to make quicker progress towards that state goal. The second strategy that's being proposed in the draft plan is to further explore inclusionary zoning fees. So fees in lieu are really only relevant for a housing developer who builds a project that's large enough to trigger the set-aside requirements for affordable housing. Inclusionary zoning fees would collect, similar to a building fee, on all substantial new construction or substantial additions, regardless of whether it's residential or commercial or industrial, or and then that money would be put into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and those expenditures could be programmed. And so that's, I think, a further conversation as part of the implementation phase is determining, the appropriateness of that mechanism, as well as some of the details around how much that fee would be should that move forward. And then finally, a recommendation on enabling middle housing through changes to your zoning regulations. And middle housing often is referred to as the missing middle. So communities tend to have regulations that support construction of single-family homes and apartments, but it's a lot more challenging to build duplexes and triplexes and some smaller multifamily developments under existing zoning. And there's also an economic component to that. And by reducing some of the zoning restrictions on that type of housing, it may allow more of those projects to move forward. So one of the strategies is to create a middle housing floating zone. And so for those not familiar with floating zones, a floating zone would exist within your regulations, and then at the discretion of the Planning and Zoning Commission and an applicant, that could be applied to a specific site and then allow middle housing to be permitted as of right, as opposed to through a special permit process. So creating a little bit more predictability in that approval process. And then in the return for that more streamlined approval process, using that workforce housing requirement within your current zoning regulations to ensure that those units remain affordable to households making less than 120% of your area median income. So this would be really a planning and zoning focused goal and strategy. And with that, I'm happy to pass it back to you and answer and clarify any questions that may come up from the public or commission members or council members. Thank you.
Before we proceed, I would like to acknowledge the work that Councilmember Bruder has done on this. He has been chairing our ad hoc committee on affordable housing, and I know that he's made very significant contributions toward bringing this work forward. So thanks, Sam. Okay. Questions of Mr. Gallagher? Mr. Bacon?
Is that me?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Thanks for the presentation. I think those are all very interesting recommendations. I have a sort of question, or could you go into some more detail, as we have discussed, I think, as a community, the need for affordable housing. We've talked both about the need for deed restricted housing that would meet the state's definition of set aside units, which would serve people with what I would call, a low income, lower than the median income, certainly, but also the need for our community to support more housing for people who are making, at the median income or above the median income by some percentage. That in fact our housing stock in single family homes, while more affordable than many communities of our type, still is unattainable for someone who's making 120, 130% of the median income, which obviously wouldn't count towards our percentage whatsoever. Is the statute that we're trying to follow by having this plan just sort of silent on any housing set aside for or priced at levels that could be affordable for people who are making above the 80% of area median income, or are we, through this planning process that we've engaged you in, really just trying to focus in on the deed restricted units that will count towards our percentage under 8-30G in the other statutes?
Great, thanks for that question, Ben. That's a great question. So the statute for affordable housing plans is really focused on creating those affordable units, which per the statutory definition would be 80% or less than area median income. But you're right, the needs don't stop at that threshold. And so we included that workforce housing recommendation, and beyond that, beyond the 120%, again, there are needs within every community, and then within your community, that would probably best be handled through your plan of conservation and development process, which I think touches on housing and housing policy more broadly than the affordable housing plan would.
And that's helpful. And I think, I just personally, I think we need to do sort of both of these things in concert with each other. I think it's a fair use, as we've talked about as the council, what the development of the trust fund might look like, to dedicate the resources in the trust fund to provide that housing that would be restricted to people at 80% of area median income, and then direct other town efforts, but perhaps not resources through the trust fund, dollars and through the trust fund to promote the development of other housing. I'm particularly interested, as someone who's not a member of the Planning and Zoning Commission, speaking through the mayor to my colleagues on the Planning and Zoning Commission, in that number 4 of your plan, of your recommendations, in making it easier to build 2, 3, 4, 5 unit housing projects across the town. I know they're allowed in certain zones right now, but they're not economically feasible for developers, given how much of the town is covered with single family 2-acre zoning, which is something I enjoy a lot and is a part of the characteristic of Mansfield. But it's an interesting idea that I think we ought to pursue. I also just want to touch on, and then I'll be quiet for the rest of the meeting, the idea around user fees or increasing fees on all new construction. And I would just state my own opinion that I think we ought to handle what funding of the trust fund needs to occur outside of the fees that have been established already for developers of large and very lucrative apartment complexes through tax dollars, rather than assessing a fee for every homeowner or property owner who wishes to build or make a renovation to their house. I think if we as a community want to make this a priority, we ought to handle it as progressively as we can, and that means, unfortunately, the property tax. And so if we need to fund this outside of those fees, I think that my personal ideological opinion is that's the proper way to do it, rather than charging someone who wants to add a floor or a room onto their house, or wants to build a house. We have, as a community, seen less new construction, I think, than other places, and it's something that we ought to consider a priority, even as we also prioritize developing affordable housing. So that's my 2 cents. Thanks very much for the presentation. It was very helpful.
Ken, I'm going to suggest that we take turns. So, because I know you've got some members with questions. My only request is, can I call on Ron Shuren, because I know he had his hand up earlier and I skipped over it.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I'm having some computer problems. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Just a quick question or two, and then a little longer one. First, technical. Are deed restricted units both rental and for purchase?
Yes.
Okay, they can be rental. Second, just a point of information, if you have it, how many naturally occurring affordable units do we have in Mansfield? I know that they can change, but as of now, has anyone done a count on that?
So I can come back to that. We did actually include that in our data analysis, so I can answer that in a little bit once I pull it up.
Okay. And then I have a couple of, I've talked to Ms. Kaufman yesterday, very helpful conversation, but some of this gets in the weeds, and if it's not appropriate now, we can talk about it later. But I used to serve on the Affordable Housing Commission in my town in New Jersey, which was under state mandate and court order. And I learned some hard and bitter lessons, and I just wanted to ask if some of these can be dealt with here. First, what will be the situation of those who may income qualify at one point, and then the income rises above eligibility for job advancement or more likely marriage? Must they vacate an affordable unit?
I don't know that off the top of my head. That would probably be a question for your housing authority.
Okay. You've alluded to this, but any way that we can deal with students who technically qualify, but, excuse me, I'm sorry. I apologize for this. Is there how can we deal with those who technically income qualified students, but not really? And just one moment, please. I apologize, please. Can claim eligibility and thus thereby crowd out what I would consider the genuinely needy people who need help. And are there legal ways of dealing with that? And perhaps that can be dealt with later.
Yeah.
Then on the deed restricted for purchase housing, this is perhaps a set of questions, but it reflects my feeling. Such can create a situation that I've seen where people observe those around them making a lot of money on their houses and they're stuck. And is there any way of alleviating that? The answer is probably no. And the second question is in deed restricted for purchase housing. An experience I witnessed was people of limited means often seriously jeopardized by home maintenance costs. They are by definition of limited means, and that is a problem. So those are just some questions, and I will have others, but perhaps best dealt with in writing or talking to various relevant housing authority people. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. So I can start by just going over some of the naturally occurring affordable housing within the community. So it somewhat depends on what income limit you use. So for ours, if we were to use a family of 4 and the income limit of $78,500 per year, you have just over 1,700 owner-occupied units that would be considered affordable to that income level, and just under 2,000 renter-occupied units. So you do have a very significant portion of naturally occurring affordable housing that is attainable but doesn't meet that statutory definition.
Because it's not mandated to stay in that.
Correct.
Yeah.
The student question is a great one that's come up throughout our process, and that's there are kind of several different approaches to that. So the first are deed restricted units that are kind of administered through a federal or a HUD program, including those operated by your housing authority, both the units that they own and operate, as well as their housing vouchers. So HUD has rules around students that would make it difficult for a dependent student to utilize those units. And so HUD has some special rules around students that has, specific definitions. If you're over a certain age and are, not and financially independent, you could qualify. But if you are under a certain age and, you're still relying on your parents for financial assistance, then you would not be eligible. Where it's a little bit more of a gray area are those units that aren't utilizing HUD funds. And I think through some conversations between the state and the municipalities that I've seen, they may have a somewhat of a different interpretation of that. And so that may be something to follow up on, with your town attorney or a land use attorney, if you're going to be setting any, requirements as part of any of these new programs.
Thank you.
Jen, I'll turn it over to you.
Katie, go right ahead.
I have a question for Pat. I'm asking if he would explain in detail how the Housing Trust Fund would work and who would be responsible for it.
Sure, that's a great question, Katie. So the Housing Trust Fund would require the town to modify its ordinances to create this fund, and then the ordinance will also specify what that money can be spent for. So that'll all be part of that ordinance drafting process. In terms of who is responsible for expenditures, in most of the towns that I reviewed that have housing trust funds, the legislative body, so in this case, the town council, is the authority for expenditures. I am aware of one community where the Planning and Zoning Commission has that authority. And so that would be part of that the next steps process is determining the oversight body. And oftentimes communities will also have a housing committee or commission that will provide an advisory role, who may make the initial recommendations for final approval by the legislative body. So it's not set in stone in statutes. There is some flexibility there.
Mr. Bruder.
Thank you, Mayor. And thank you again for your compliment earlier. I just wanted to point out that, and then I'll get to my question, but I wanted to point out that everyone on the committee has done such a great job at, it's easy showing up kind of deal. But, it seems like there's based on the surveys, that there's a big push, or there's a lot of support for the deed restriction. I know I myself am in that boat. But I had a couple questions for you, Pat. Based on the 2010 numbers, how many more units do we need to reach that minimum threshold? And if you need to get back to me, that's fine. I have another question. Because I know you said in our presentation that whatever amount of units based on the 2010 numbers is going to go up, just given the amount of building that has happened over the last 10 years. And then in terms of the housing trust fund, what's the level of funding? Like what size does the account need to be, kind of deal? Like, does it need to have $1 million? I don't do buildings, so I don't know any of this kind of stuff. Does it need to have, 50 million? Because I think that's going to really influence my support in terms of, do we raise taxes? Do we use some more of this, hopefully consistent pilot money that we'll be getting? Do we divert some of that towards the housing trust? I agree with the other sentiments, I believe, by Councilor Shake in regards to, do we really want to put more fees on building permits? I don't know if there's like a floor that we can set it at so that it only affects a certain segment of higher income or something like that. But I don't know if you had an answer for how many units.
Yeah, so great question. So to answer the first question, if we were to take your 2010 housing units and see how many more units you need about 200 additional units. Probably a little bit more than that, because that would then change your denominator as well. And I believe, and Jennifer, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we've had, is it 700 or 900 new units built since 2010? And so 10% of that, you're looking at 70 or 90 more on top of that. So probably 300 or more in order to hit that threshold. And then the question on kind of inclusionary zoning fees and kind of caps and things like that, again, that would probably be something to follow up with your town council or a land use attorney on just some of the mechanics behind the statutes that enable that. And then I think I maybe missed the middle question.
Yeah, what's the size of a housing trust fund that you've seen? Like, if we need to say for discussion purposes or questions, 300 units. And I know that it'll depend, because it'll depend on, how much are we willing to do with repairs in exchange for the deed restriction? Do we want to just buy the land and then give it away to the developer? But just on average, as you have been in this field and certainly know more than I do, like what's a good number, if you could have it in there regularly type deal?
Yeah, I think it depends on how you plan on programming that money. If you're going to be funding new construction, we're talking hundreds of thousands, if not, $1 million or more, depending on the project, to provide that gap funding. If the trust fund is more limited and focused on kind of repair and rehabilitation, if you think about those types of projects, those might be in the $10,000 range or the tens of thousands of dollar range. But new construction is going to be much more expensive, and the funding gaps that developers may have are going to be much greater.
Right. Thank you. That was helpful.
Vera? Vera Ward, go right ahead. Vera, you're muted.
I'm interested in your focus on the deed restrictive units. I wonder what the incentive is for that, because we've already had a problem with people wanting to charge market rate for their deed restrictive unit, because of course the discrepancy is very wide on that. So I wondered, what is the incentive to do that? Is it tax relief? What would make someone want to do that?
So that's a great question, Vera. So I think the way that that deed restrictions typically come about is some sort of financial incentive. So for a lot of new construction that it includes deed restricted units, oftentimes they'll require some sort of funding from the Department of Housing or Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, and in exchange for that money, they require deed restrictions for a certain period of time.
I thought the deed restrictions went with the property and never came off.
It depends. So certain units can be protected permanently, and I believe many of your units are. However, oftentimes, especially for those that are receiving that state financing, it's usually a 30 or a 40-year period, and then that can be renewed again. And so that's, kind of one of those other challenges of maintaining those units as affordable, because once the deed restriction expires, then it will no longer be protected or count towards that 10% goal. But typically there is a financial incentive that someone will need in order to do that exchange for a deed restriction.
Is that initial startup, or is that ongoing?
So typically it's upfront.
So that wears off pretty fast, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
Sam again?
Thank you, Mayor. Vera reminded me some of the discussion, so I came up with another question. In regards to the deed restriction, am I correct in that we also have talked about that an existing housing unit, I think you mentioned something in the realm of 1,700 units and then 2,000 units already naturally occurring kind of deal. For anybody in those units, and we can always make it focus on certain neighborhoods, that we want. But is it an option to, in exchange for repairs for an existing housing unit, they give us the deed restriction for 40 years, and then that state statute is met and our requirements are good until that comes up again? Is that my understanding?
Yep, that is correct. So if you were to have a housing trust program for repair or rehabilitation, that could be one of the stipulations, is that in order to receive up to a certain amount, you have to deed restrict your unit. So that could, help kind of meet two goals of increasing the number of affordable units. And then also we know that repair and rehabilitation is also really important to the community.
And so have you seen other communities where that's been used as certainly like for, seniors who want to stay in place type deal, or, make a housing unit more accessible?
So this is actually something where I wasn't able to find a case study of someone purchasing an existing unit, with the exception of the town of Farmington has a program that provides, it's a cooperative home ownership program, and that's usually at the onset of the purchase of a home. The town pays for the cost of the land, and then the homeowner pays for the cost of the building. I'm not aware of any communities that have actually done that where it wasn't tied to a sale. So that would be somewhat of uncharted territory. But from my understanding of the statutes, I don't think there's anything that that's that specific that talks about those types of things. So it would definitely be worth exploring.
Luann, go right ahead.
Hi, thank you. Listening to this, I'm struck with the idea that there isn't a single strategy, nor should we pursue a single strategy. Instead, we should pursue a mix of things, or maybe an all of the things type of strategy. Can you give any examples of other communities that have used several of these strategies to either raise money for affordable housing, or to set aside existing housing, or repair existing housing? It shouldn't be a one type of thing. Is this correct? It should be multiple strategies. But I could see if you tried to do too many things, that could be too confusing. It could lead to more complexity in the marketplace that would make it difficult to get projects accomplished.
Yeah, that's a great question. And for most of the case studies that we have, I think their primary focus for towns that have housing trust funds is to build units that get them closer to that 10% threshold. And frankly, I think many of those towns have established that mechanism, a trust fund and however they're funded, to try to get a moratorium and build enough units to get that temporary reprieve. So the trust funds that I have seen tend to focus on new units and less on repair and rehabilitation. Sometimes there's other programs, through community development block grants that may kind of fill in that gap. But from what I've seen from the trust funds, that's mostly new construction.
Mr. Sharon.
Yeah, just a question out of curiosity. Mansfield has the benefit of a number of mobile homes that are presumably part of our affordable universe. Do regulations permit these to be counted, and how does that work in this context?
So that would fall under the same categories as your other housing types. So if it has a permanent protection or deed restriction, it would count. But if it does not, then it would not count as affordable, and it would be in that naturally occurring bucket. And I know that was an item that was discussed this last legislative session. I may have to dig a little bit and see if anything's changed in terms of how those units are counted.
Yeah.
Mr. Galler, I have a question. It's really about the makeup of the housing authority and how it comes into being. Typically, are these groups appointed? Are they elected? And is there generally some professional staff? It would seem to me that it would require professional staff to work with a housing authority that has this kind of mandate that we're considering.
Mm-hmm. Great question, Ken. So again, this is just speaking from kind of my review of other towns and case studies. Most of them, I believe, are appointed commissions, since most of them have an advisory role as opposed to direct control over expenditures. And so again, they would be acting in that advisory role. And you're absolutely right on staff. And that's why that we have that first recommendation of, this is not just necessarily a policy commitment. There's going to need to be investment on the staffing and also expertise side. You may need someone with more of a background in real estate, finance perhaps, if you're going to be administering hundreds of thousands of dollars from a fund. So you're absolutely right, Ken, that'll require some investment by the town as well.
And a follow-up to this, if we were to go through, as I understand what you presented earlier, town council really has oversight over this. It would seem to me that we're adding a rather substantial layer of responsibility to town council. I'll leave it.
You just muted yourself, Ken.
My last comment was that if town council has the ultimate oversight of this particular operation, we're laying quite a substantial burden on town council.
So again, that would be something for the implementation phase. You know, should you choose to go forward, is, you know, what is the oversight mechanism? Do you have that advisory committee who has the authority to administer the funds? But yeah, great point, Ken.
I will call him Mr. Shaken, but I have two questions myself first. In terms of responsibility, I think there are models in the existing housing authority and in the housing authority corporation, which is attempting to build the houses on South Eagleville. So there may be a model already. And I would assume that some of this would fall under our town finance department to administer. It wouldn't be strictly council. But I have two unrelated questions. The first one is, how does the fund get replenished? If we fill this fund with new construction, there may come a time when we don't need any more apartment buildings in town and the big construction stops. How does the fund get replenished?
Yep, so that's a great question. So that again speaks to your options that are on the table, which is your fee in lieu, which currently exists, and perhaps inclusionary zoning fees if council sees that as a direction the town wants to take. So both of those mechanisms, or through the regular town budget process or through grants, would provide that funding into the fund. And then in terms of the expenditures, that'll again, I think, largely be driven by how much money you have. If there reaches a point where perhaps there isn't as much money coming into the fund, you know, if you're sticking with a fee in lieu mechanism, for example, and you don't have any major residential developments over a long period of time, that will eventually, and you're still spending money out of the fund, that'll eventually result in it being depleted. And so that may be kind of more of a programmatic shift of, if you don't have enough money to cover, for example, new construction, are you pivoting towards more cost-effective programs?
And my second question is, can we use this fund to provide support, rental support, along the line of Section 8 in existing houses that might not qualify?
So that would be something that, again, I would probably follow up with a council or a land use attorney. I'm not aware of any communities that do that program today. However, I don't necessarily think that means it's not possible. It would all depend on the statutes and how they're written.
So, I mean, that would not necessarily require a deed restricted property, but it might be a guarantee that a certain percentage of families would get assistance.
Correct. Yeah, and that would probably be something worth following up with the state if that's a direction you want to go as well, because that might be, you know, if there's no precedent, you'll want to make sure that counts towards the 10%.
Yes, of course.
But yeah, great point.
Mr. Shaken, and then I'll turn it back to Ken Ron. Ben?
I want to follow up on some of the discussion with a comment and a question. You know, first, Ken, I think Ken's absolutely right, and there's this really interesting conflict in how this could theoretically work. In that, if you had a council that was put in charge of what could be millions, you know, with the goal of increasing our deed restricted affordable units, and you had a planning and zoning commission who didn't want to have parts of town that had big, you know, if we need hundreds of units with big new housing developments, that, you know, a community could sort of be at odds with itself. I don't think we have that situation here, but there really isn't any good, like, statutory way for both of our bodies to work together officially. You know, we have committees where we can talk and figure stuff out, but it just seems like something missing from statutes in this particular arena. And another thing missing, this is my question, something that Ron was talking about earlier, just I was surprised, I think, to hear how many, affordable housing units exist in the town when you stop considering only housing with deed restrictions to be affordable. And so I'm just curious, as you've worked and done case studies across the state, are there other communities? How many other communities are there? Do you have examples where the official number is what our official number is? So 6%, or really more like 4 or 5 when you take into consideration the new units that have come online in the last 11 years. But who, when you do an analysis of both the rental and the single family housing stock in town, have such a comparably much higher rate of housing available for people who make 80% of area, that would be affordable for someone making $78,000 a year with a family of 4. Are we unique, or is it something that's very common that you see?
So it's definitely very common, and especially in, I'd say, more exurban or rural areas within kind of metropolitan areas, and I think Mansfield would fall into that category where it really reflects your overall housing costs. So the income limits are calculated on a region-wide basis. So I believe Mansfield is in the Hartford metro area for their calculation. And so if you're kind of on the periphery of the Hartford metro area where your housing costs are lower, I would bet that most of your peer communities, most of your neighboring towns would fall into that same boat. It gets a little bit different, I think, when we get down into the I-95 corridor where housing prices are a lot more expensive. But in kind of the greater Hartford area, from the other communities we've worked in, having a large naturally occurring stock is very common.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Yes, Benu, go right ahead.
Thank you. I was wondering what the next steps are in the process after this public hearing. Where do we go from here? And how?
Jennifer, you want to touch on that?
So the next steps are for the Planning and Zoning Commission and the Town Council to adopt this plan, and then we begin on implementation. So tonight we're having the public hearing. We still need to hear from a couple members of the public, and then at the Planning and Zoning Commission meeting of July 6th, I'm hoping to put that on your agenda and hoping that you can act on that. And then I think July 12th for the council. And then we'll move forward from there. We'll edit the plan and it will become official. And then we have the fun of implementing it.
So we edit the plan before we adopt it, right? If we want to edit the plan.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
If we want to edit the plan, we have to edit it before we adopt it.
Correct, yeah.
Ron?
Yeah, I just want to ask if I'm correct in assuming the following. There are two things that we have to be concerned about. One is meeting the state mandate. Clearly, we don't as of now. The second, just leaving that aside in our minds for just a moment, do we have enough affordable places for people of limited means to live in Mansfield? And it sounds like we kind of do. Am I correct?
You do have a large affordable housing stock that definitely came through in the data analysis. I think one of the challenges is who's occupying your current naturally occurring for affordable housing stock, and that came through in our survey very clearly. Is that while you do have those naturally occurring affordable units, oftentimes students will occupy those units, and so that leaves other segments of your population, families with children, seniors, who just don't have the means to compete for those same units. And so I think that's the challenge as a university town that Mansfield faces, and another reason why deed restricted units were a big focus of the ad hoc committee, because that allows at least some level of control and an eligibility for who could occupy those units.
Luann, go right ahead.
Just for a little context, there are only 31 towns in all of Connecticut that are actually meeting the 10% mandate right now. That's it. So we are not alone in this problem, and the legislature, I think, is quite aware of that. And there were efforts to try to change the way this is working to give towns actually more control to set their own goals based on the specific kinds of housing issues that they have in their towns. That had quite a lot of support, but was eventually did not go through. It's unclear whether or not that will be introduced again. So while we absolutely should try to increase affordable housing in the town, and we need to work under the rules that we have currently, it is something we should be aware of, that those rules could change, could be amended in the future. So one of the challenges I think that we face is that when you're talking about housing, you're talking about something that's a long-term proposition. It's not something that you can change in a year. It's not something that you can change in 2 or 3 years. And so we need to keep in mind that making that mandate is important, but that is a goal that could change in the future.
Any other council members have questions? Are there any other questions from planning and zoning, Ken?
No, I don't have a question.
All right. Is there anybody in the audience who wishes to participate in this public hearing?
I believe there were 3 individuals that had reached out to Tasha, and I don't know if they're all on the line or all connected right now. Tasha, do you have those names?
Yes, there is Paul Stern, Edith Allison, and I don't see Melissa anymore, but Paul and Edith are still on the line.
And Paul submitted an email to be read into the record, but seeing as he appears to be on, Paul, if you can hear me, if you want to unmute yourself, you can speak for yourself.
I can hear you, and I'm going to say less than my written testimony, if you want to call it testimony. But there are a couple points I'd like to make to kind of underscore what I've submitted to you in writing, which is probably more intelligent than what I'm going to say now. But the first thing I'd like to notice is that this affordable housing plan has a lot to like. It has the right objectives, I think. It acknowledges the history behind the situation we're in now, and it comes up with a lot of, I think, workable strategies to address the problem. One of those strategies is the adoption of allowance of more middle housing, which I think is good. Another is this notion of raising to 12% the amount of affordable housing the developer would have to provide when doing a project. And the idea of a housing trust fund is a interesting one. I think what you're really talking about when you're talking about a housing trust fund is to make it meaningful is to have almost an administration that's supported by the fund, and along with that is a lot of cost. And if we're serious about the objectives that the plan identifies, that correcting socioeconomic problems and a rising tide lifts all boats and that sort of thing, then I think we have to anticipate that there's going to be a cost to all taxpayers. I don't personally have a problem with that. I think it would benefit us all if we could diversify our communities and provide more affordable housing. But there's some obvious obstacles there. There is one smaller element of this plan, though, that I have a problem with, and it's the payment in lieu of concept, at least as it's being applied now. Right now, it seems to me it provides kind of a mathematical problem and an incentive for the developers of these big projects to buy their way out of providing the affordable housing that we need. and putting the burden and the cost, extra administrative cost of providing that housing over onto the town or indirectly the taxpayers. I don't think developers we're in a market that's highly attractive to developers. It would seem we've got like some 1,000 units waiting for review up in Four Corners alone, and those companies are here because we have a hot market, particularly created by the university. So I don't think we ought to be willing to let them in and do their thing unless they contribute significantly to the affordable housing shortage. And the payment in lieu of, I don't know what kind of fees you'd have to establish to actually motivate them to get enough money from the developers to compensate for the housing that they're not willing to build. I think it's much more efficient and certainly faster for us to squeeze them for the affordable units that we need and make them provide them. If they want to come to Mansfield and make a lot of money on our market, they ought to be willing to contribute their share. On the other hand, I understand that I don't think putting the burden of affordable housing on the backs of developers and home improvements and that sort of thing ought to fall strictly on those people. I don't think it should, to be fair, and I don't think it can, to be practical. So that's what I have to say in short.
Thank you. Thanks for your contribution. We will take a look at your written comments as well.
Thank you.
Edith, do you have something to add?
Hi, can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay. I have a very brief comment, and it's just to express my thanks to the PZC for establishing the ad hoc committee and to the members of the committee for their work on the plan. I want to add my voice to those speaking in favor of increasing the affordable housing stock in town. We already have a fairly strong, diverse community in Mansfield. It's one of the things that makes living here wonderful. But I believe the establishment of more affordable and workforce housing in town will ensure that we stay that way. Just a couple of comments on things that came up. Ron, you asked about the need for affordable housing. Do we actually really need this? And I would say that the waiting list for Housing Authority properties and the Section 8 program would speak to the idea that we do have a demand. In terms of fee in lieu, I think there are great ways of using those fees to transfer dollars to projects that are more in line with the kinds of needs we want to meet rather than, for instance, putting affordable units in student housing. We might be able to put them more into family housing or senior housing or something like that. That allows the transfer of funds to more appropriate projects. And also that the Housing Authority in town may be able to partner with the town in terms of administration. I think that should be explored. That's my comments.
Thank you. Is there anybody else who wishes to speak to this public hearing or? Tasha?
No, there were just those three, and Melissa is no longer on the line.
Okay. If you could communicate with her and offer her the opportunity to submit something in writing, since she had to leave early, I would guess. Jennifer?
I did want to note for the record that we did receive a communication from Toivo Cast, and that is in your packet. So that should be part of the record as well.
Yep. Sam?
If I could just point out that communication has some really good knowledge that both Jen and Linda put together in response to some of the questions that we were getting, and that's why it was asked to be included. So thank you to both of them.
All right. Is there anything else to be done as part of this public hearing? and there's no public who wishes to address us in addition. So I think the last thing on the council's agenda is a motion to adjourn. Is there anything else on the planning and zoning agenda?
I don't believe so. Is there anybody on the Planning and Zoning Commission who has some discussion point that maybe we've left out here? No, if not, Ms. Mayor, I think that we're done for the evening here.
All right, then I'm going to declare this hearing closed. This obviously will be a subject that's going to be discussed at greater length as time goes by. There's obviously a lot of work, a lot of thought, a lot of decision making. And so we will be talking again one way or the other. So I will entertain a motion for the council to adjourn. I see Mr. Osberger has moved to adjourn. Is there a second?
That would be the second.
That would be the second. Ms. Berthelot moves. Whoever moves first or second. Is there anybody on the town council who objects to adjourning? Okay, thank you. The town council has adjourned.
Goodbye, all.
Planning and Zoning is a little less formal. Good night, folks.
Good night, everybody.
Right.
Good night,
Good night,
everybody.
everybody.
It's nice to be together.
Yeah.